In this lesson, we'll dive deep into steps 2 and 3 of our funnel analysis, calculating the problem magnitude and evaluating the potential business value. The process of evaluating how much a problem can be improved is where new PMs typically get stuck. This happens for 2 reasons. First, PMs want to be rigorous and precise in their analysis. However, in the early stages of a project, there's rarely enough information to reach the level of precision PMs strive for. At this stage, it's more important to be generally and directionally correct than spend too much time tweaking and refining estimates. For example, you probably don't need to spin your wheels refining your value estimate between 2 and 6%. In reality, the leadership team is looking for directionality in order of magnitude. They care whether this is going to be a 1%, 10%, or 20% value add, but the difference between 2% and 6% isn't important. The second issue is that PMs often struggle to make assumptions where there's no data available in the earlier stages of a project. This is where data from projects within the company, or even projects conducted by other companies, can be used to inform and support your estimates. In this lesson, we'll show you how to use your funnel to visualize and calculate the problem magnitude, and in turn, evaluate your potential business value. Along the way, we'll walk through the refined business value template, which you can fill out as we go. We'll also continue walking through our Lyft feature opportunity, which the driver experience team hopes will improve the end-of-session experience for commuting drivers. We'll pick this example back up using the funnel we built in the last lesson. Along with the blank business value template, we've also provided a template that's populated with this example. Let's start with calculating the problem magnitude. There are 2 steps to this calculation: establishing the baseline performance of the funnel and identifying and quantifying the problem area of the funnel. Let's start with establishing the baseline performance. To establish this baseline, we want to identify how many users move from one step to the next in our funnel over a given time frame. This shows us how many users successfully move through the funnel and how many drop off. Sometimes you won't have data at a granular level for each step. In that case, if you have data that allows you to combine steps, work with that. For example, let's imagine you don't have data that tracks how many customers go through the product tour step in the Zendesk funnel we built in the last lesson. However, you do have data for the customers that had live calls with the sales team. Instead of measuring the product tour step, you would go straight from accessing the website to completing a sales call. Even though you don't have the data points for product tours represented, you can infer that the product tour experience may drive some of the drop-off you see between those 2 steps. Once we've established our funnel, we want to narrow in on the specific problem that we'd like to solve and evaluate how big that problem is. There are 2 scenarios we commonly see: when the problem area is specific and already known, or when we need to identify the problem. The first scenario is straightforward. In many cases, we already know at which step the problem occurs in our funnel. User interviews, internal team feedback, or product signals can all tell us where a specific issue lies in the user journey. But that's not always the case. When we're given a business goal but don't have a clear mapping of the user problem to the funnel, we need to use funnel analysis to identify which steps we should focus on. To do this, we can evaluate a few things. First, where do the biggest drop-offs happen? If we see a sharp drop between 2 steps of the funnel, that suggests this might be an area of opportunity to explore. Second, which steps show unexpected drop-offs? Drop-offs that are larger or different than we hypothesized will help us refine our hypotheses. Third, which user segments show the biggest problems? We might further segment our data to see if some types of users show an unusually large drop-off in certain steps. This segmentation might help us further narrow the target audience for the problem. Let's see what this looks like for our Lyft driver experience example. In the last lesson, we built a feature funnel to capture the driver's journey from starting a driving session to completing a ride. Lyft's driver experience PM can then populate this funnel using existing driver data captured over the past several months. Please note that while this is based on a real example, all data provided in the template is illustrative. Using this data, the driver experience PM observes that the biggest drop-off points are in steps 1 and 2, when drivers receive a request and when they accept the ride. However, these drop-offs are largely driven by how much rider demand there is at the time. While balancing supply and demand was still a priority for Lyft, the scope of this opportunity focused on a drop-off point that fell more squarely under the control of the driver experience team. Step 4, or drivers that cancel a ride after they arrive and view the passenger's destination. At this point in the funnel, the PM calculated a 4% drop-off. In other words, while steps 1 and 2 were the biggest points of drop-off, step 4 was where the team saw an unexpected drop-off. Cancellations at this point in the funnel are unexpected because there should be very few reasons for a driver to do all this work and then decide not to pick the rider up. At the same time, Lyft drivers weren't shown the rider's destination until they arrived at the pickup spot. Imagine you're a driver who has already invested time and gas into driving to a pickup spot. You've already done a lot of work and aren't yet earning an income for it. You only start getting paid when the passenger gets in and the ride begins, and yet, before the ride can begin, you cancel. So while a 4% drop-off rate isn't the highest drop-off rate, it's much higher than it should be for where it is in the funnel. This is why the team chose to focus on addressing it. Once you've identified the problem area and calculated the magnitude of the problem, you're ready for step 3, evaluating the potential business value. This means estimating how much you can reduce that drop-off with your project work. To evaluate potential business value, you need to determine how much of the problem you can solve with your project. But since you haven't yet built your feature, you need to make a calculated guess based on the information you have on hand. As we mentioned, a lot of new PMs struggle with this step because there's very limited data at the earlier stages of a project, or they might not even be sure about what assumptions they can make. This is where using proxies from previous projects can be beneficial. Proxies from projects within the company, or even projects conducted by other companies, can be used to inform and support your estimates. So to effectively estimate business value, you need to do 2 things. Determine the right proxy metrics for your estimate, and use the proxy metric to determine the impact on your baseline. Let's start with determining the proxy metric. There are 2 types of proxy metrics you can use: internal proxies and external proxies. Internal proxies are metrics from projects your company has already run that are similar to the project you're currently running. Similar projects can come in a couple of forms. The first is same feature, different application. Let's imagine you're redesigning your product homepage and trying to estimate the impact on conversion. One internal proxy may be the conversion lift you saw on previous homepage redesigns. The common thread here is the homepage redesign, even though the timing and purpose of that redesign may be different. The second kind of internal proxy is different feature, similar application. Let's imagine your homepage redesign intends to make purchasing information more prominent by featuring it either at the top of the page or in a modal that pops up once you land on the page. A good proxy might be a previous redesign of your blog that also featured a purchase modal. While the actual page you redesigned was different, the purpose of the redesign was in line with this homepage redesign. The second type of proxy metric is external proxies. External proxies are examples from other companies, which can be useful when you have no similar internal projects on which to base your estimates. There are 4 types of similarities you can evaluate when looking for appropriate proxy metrics for your project. First, you can look at your industry. Has a competitor in your industry done a similar project? You can use their results as proxies for estimation. Next, you can look at audience. If players in other industries have targeted a similar experience, you can use the results of their efforts to estimate your own. You could also use companies of a similar stage of growth and size in terms of customer base or revenue, gauging their results to estimate the business impact for similar projects. Or you can look at companies with similar business models as proxies to estimate business impact. Once you have your proxy metrics, you can use them to evaluate your potential business value. To do this, you'll take the problem area and magnitude you identified and estimate how much of that problem you could fix based on the proxy metrics. For instance, say your baseline activation rate was 20%. That means 20% of the users you acquired were successfully activated. Now, you might have worked on an activation project previously in which you saw a 10% improvement in activation rate. You could use that value as a proxy and say you can improve activation by approximately 10% in your project. It's important to note that proxy metrics won't always work. If all else fails, the best thing to do is make assumptions. Check them with your product lead or other product managers who've been doing this for a while, and then very clearly state your assumptions in a product review to make sure everyone agrees. We'll talk about product reviews in the next section. Now let's walk through the Lyft example to see how this applies. The driver experience team identified the drop-off rate at step 4, where a driver has arrived at the pickup spot yet cancels before actually picking up the passenger, as the problem area they wanted to address. The drop-off rate at that time was 4%. There were no perfect proxies for a destination filtering feature that specifically targeted commuting Lyft drivers. The team chose to use an internal proxy for a different feature with a similar application. Step 3 in the Lyft driver funnel, Arrive and View Passenger Destination, was actually a recently developed feature. This feature showed drivers the destination of their passenger once they arrived at the pickup spot, but before the passenger got in the car and started the ride. When the team evaluated the performance of this feature, they observed a 3% increase in cancellations before the passenger was picked up. In other words, while the old cancellation rate had been 1%, this feature increased that rate to 4%. The team used driver profile information and user interviews to determine that most of this additional 3% of cancellations came from commuting drivers at the end of their sessions. The team knew that 3% represented the upper bound of what they could impact, so they decided to reduce the proxy metric to account for edge cancellation cases that the new feature wouldn't address. By cutting the 3% in half, they estimated that the new destination filtering feature would be able to reduce cancellations, and therefore the drop-off rate at step 4 by 1.5%. That wraps up our Lyft example. This opportunity eventually turned into Lyft's popular destination mode filter, which enabled drivers to more easily find rides that got them closer to their destination. Destination mode became one of the most impactful features for the company and a key differentiator for many years that attracted many ride-sharing drivers. And it delivered on the team's goal of reducing end-of-session ride cancellations. Now that we've conducted funnel analysis and refined our business value hypotheses, we're ready to move on to the last phase of feature opportunity validation, validating and communicating the opportunity.